Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today for our annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture. Uh, just to get out of the way, if you could please silence your cell phones, just so we do not interrupt the talk. My name is Muhammad. I'm the Executive Director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. On behalf of our board of directors and our staff, we would like to welcome you all here today and also welcome to our online audience. It's also a great honor to introduce and welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. David Palumbo-Liu, who will be delivering this year's Edward Said Memorial Lecture, which is titled Literature, Empathy, and Rights. Edward Said was, among many things, a scholar of comparative literature. Professor Palumbo-Liu's talk today will focus on three key concerns that Edward Said addressed via his study of literature. First and foremost was the issue of being in the world. Literature was a social as well as an aesthetic phenomenon. Second, literature could draw people together in a cosmopolitan spirit, drawing on the human capacity for empathy. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, any idealization of that cosmopolitan spirit had to grapple with the realities of injustice and prejudice, which divert and stifle empathy. In terms of literature, the blocking, distortion, and erasure of stories was tantamount to the erasure of lives. Professor Palumbo-Liu's talk will discuss how our commitments to empathy and ethics can only be met if we acknowledge the ways the realities of Palestine have been obscured and distorted. He will end by putting forward a vision of comparative literature that he hopes might conjoin with the model of literary studies that Edward Said embodied. At the core of this lecture is the issue of rights. A little bit about Dr. David Palumbo-Liu. He is the Louise Hewlett Nixon Professor at Stanford University, where he is also Professor of Comparative Literature and English. Professor Palumbo-Liu's fields of interest include social and cultural criticism, literary theory and criticism, and critical human rights. He has published numerous book chapters and scholarly articles. Many of these have been translated into Chinese, German, French, and Portuguese. His most recent book, The Deliverance of Others, Reading Literature in a Global Age, addresses the role of contemporary literature with regard to transnational ethical thinking. He has written articles that have appeared in such magazines as Salon, Truth Out, The Nation, The Guardian, Alternet, and Al Jazeera. He also founded and directs the Teaching Human Rights Collaboratory, an international website for human rights teachers, activists, and students. Dr. Palumbo-Liu will speak for about 40 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. We ask that you please, for the questions and answers, if you could just wait until the mic comes to you so that everybody can hear online as well. And for our online audience, you can tweet your questions to @Palestine Center. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. David Palumbo-Liu.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I know that at the beginning of lectures like these, you usually say, well, I'm very honored to be here, et cetera, et cetera. And I sincerely mean this. This is the greatest honor of my life. And I can't say more than that. It's really. One of Edward Said's books is entitled The Text, the World, and the Critic. And for you to appreciate why that was so important, for so many years, literary studies in the United States was very much focused on what they called the literary object. I mean, looking at it aesthetically, formally, what made it tick. There was a period of time when we wanted to scientize it. So what was the science of the text? And all of these ways of approaching literature demanded that the text be extracted from the world, almost like put in a petri dish by itself, and put under a microscope so you could really see what made it tick. And Edward Said decidedly did not subscribe to that vision of literature. For him, it was embedded in the world. And importantly, as was the critic. Critics were no longer supposed to be simply objective scientists that would look at the text as if it could exist in itself. But they were also historical human beings they also were impacted upon history. And very importantly, they too had a social responsibility to make their knowledge important to the world. So I want to talk a lot about that. One of the first times I spoke at an Edward Said memorial was shortly after his passing. And I was speaking with the novelist Hada Karmi, who's the author of In Search of Fatima. And after I gave my talk, Dr. Karmi said, "You primarily claim Edward Said for the world of literature. I claim him as a spokesperson for the Palestinians." And then she went on and gave a remarkable talk. And during the question and answer period, she was asked, well, what gives you hope or what gives you despair? And she said, what gives me hope is more elusive. What gives me despair right now, I can tell you, is that the Zionists have captured the narrative. And we spent some time talking about that. What would that mean? Narratives can be a powerful political tool with long-lasting consequences. Once Edward was asked, rather antagonistically, if he denied the Jewish narrative. And he said, "I don't deny there's a Jewish narrative. What I deny is that there's only one narrative." But that sadly in the United States, as most of us know, has been the case for many, 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 many years. It's this one dominant narrative that tends to be the image that we have when we think not of Palestine but of Israel. And what's hopeful today, I think, is that it's been challenged in very powerful ways, and that's what I'm going to be gravitating toward. Any kind of narrative with regard to Palestine is inextricably tied to territory, and any narrative that talks about territory is a justification for possession of territory. And Edward once said, "I see my own history and the history of my people as a function of that struggle over territory." And it was always about territory. But then he goes on, and he says, "The interesting thing is that it was never territory taken for the sake of territory." Then he goes on to explain what he means. "What always happened was a conflict over these justifications with, you might say, the bodies, the realities of the people there. Therefore, it was a struggle over geography, but also over justification, philosophy, epistemology, and whose land it is." So think of that cluster of concerns, right? Geography, philosophy, epistemology, what is the truth content, whose land it is, but also a justification, which is a narrative, after all, right? And it incorporates people into the land, and it gives that relationship a kind of density. And when it is a justification for dispossession, that dispossession becomes all that much more strong. So literature can indeed represent land, geography, and territory, but each claim to territory comes from a human voice and a collective reality. Said was deeply concerned when that voice and that reality was oppressed, suppressed, and silenced. This silencing, which in the Palestinian case is of course closely related to the deprivation of a state, is fundamentally attached to the loss of what Hannah Arendt called the loss of the possibility of fighting for freedom. I'm just going to quote two passages from Arendt. One, "Whoever leaves his polis or is banished from it loses not just his hometown or his fatherland. He also loses the only space in which he can be free, and he loses the society of his equals." Then she goes on to say how this act of physical and political displacement now creates, quote, "a certain category of people excluded even from the possibility of fighting for freedom." Right? So in other words, without a state, you don't have the international political mechanisms with which to argue. So when he was asked about this idea of rights by an interviewer, the interviewer says, "You wrote someplace that the Palestinian experience is so fragmented that classical concepts don't apply. What about the concept of rights?" And Said replied, "Well, we are in a unique position of being a people whose enemies say we don't exist." So for us, the concept of rights means the right to exist as a people, as a collective whole body, rather than a collection of refugees, stateless peoples, citizens of other countries. And I wanted to pause over what might seem, an insignificant set of words. When he says, so for us, I think we really need to focus on that. It's a declaration that there's a particular positionality that the Palestinian people occupy. And Said is trying to get the interviewer to understand the particularity of that position rather than simply say, well, this classical idea of rights is universally applicable. So he insists on the perspective of the Palestinian experience. And I want to tie this in to the possibility of articulating rights through literature. And Darwish has an interesting statement where he says, poetry cannot found a state, but it can metaphorically create in the imagination the possibility of a state. And then he has this wonderful line, and I would like to think that my poems have built a couple of houses on that homeland, which of course they did. But in the same spirit as Said insists on looking at the specific history of Palestinians, it's important to not believe that language is a neutral instrument that is universally, like rights, transparent to each and every individual on the face of the earth. Language alone cannot do the trick. We need to recall the ways that even supposedly neutral language comes with a history and a relationship to power, the kind of power that Said implies in the term justification that I talked about earlier on. So one of the few times I met Edward Said was he came to Stanford to deliver what was called the Ian Watt lectures. Ian Watt was a very famous British literary critic who then moved to the United States, and he introduced Edward Said in one of the most unself-conscious ways that I can imagine. Because during this was during the 80s, and theory was a big deal in literary scholarship, and everybody was reading Derrida and deconstruction and coming out with these cryptic sentences. And Ian Watt's way of praising Edward Said was to introduce him as saying, besides all the wonderful things he did, he said, one thing I most appreciate about Edward is that his command of the English language was so perfect. And you begin to wonder, what is Edward Said going to say? He says, he's not like these stupid theorists. You can really, the Queen's English. You're like, oh my God, what are you going to say? And so Edward gets up, and his usual gracious self, he said, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Ian, but some of us were caned. Some of us learned English in a very different way than you did. Some of us were caned if we didn't speak it properly. So, yeah, I thought that was very good. So the idea of language as having a history and coming from a place and being learned through different forces, coercions, comes out very powerfully in a remarkable essay by Anton Shammas called Torture into Affidavit. And I'm just going to read a few paragraphs of it. Basically, as you all know, Anton Shammas is a novelist. He's also a great translator. And he's wondering, he looks at the difficulty of translating Palestinian pain into a human rights document. And then in the second half of his essay, he makes a parallel between that and translating Arabic poetry into Hebrew. Okay, so he first talks about the difficulty of translating Palestinian pain, and he writes, quote, "The act of translating torture into affidavit assumes that subjective pain, when inflicted on the human body, could even be articulated and then translated and then formulated into a legal document. And as if this convoluted assumption weren't enough, we have to bear in mind that in this case, the act of torturing the Palestinian body by itself is a non-verbal translation of an unwritten military order formulated in Israeli Hebrew, either verbally or non-verbally, and that the pain suffered by the victim could be articulated if at all, in Arabic, then translated into Hebrew, and then edited into a chaste English version in the form of an affidavit, the only form of narrative accepted in court, and for the sake of the readers who are willing enough to listen to a faint, 3-time removed narrative of pain. Shamas then specifies why these particular languages are unable to represent the particular human object in question. Again, the variable human that we have to entertain when we talk about human rights. Quote, Palestinian pain does not simply resist language as such. It also resists being translated into a specific language, Hebrew, the language of the occupier, whose implicit objective over some 120 years of Zionism has always been to suppress, delegitimize, outlaw, and annihilate the Palestinian Arabic. Hebrew for Palestinians has always been the violent language of occupation, dispossession, the violent language of destruction used as a weapon for the unmaking of the body and soul of Palestinian subjects. So when a Palestinian testimony of torture is translated into Hebrew, no matter how empathetic the translator might be, it will always stand the grave risk of being deemed unreliable, of being articulated in a suspect dialect, attempting subversively at acquiring the status of language, to be on a par with Hebrew. And when that testimony is transferred into English, into the legal the legal genre of the affidavit, it will always be read through all these destabilizing filters. Right. So how can we work through this very difficult problematic of expression and representation, most especially for effect? And he goes on to say, in much the same spirit as Darwish's quote, that in his attempt to translate Palestinian poetry into Hebrew, he's creating what he calls a virtual return, and trying to create in poetry exactly that imaginary homeland without the capacity to imagine in certain ways, no political project can really be successful. You need the ability to imagine a world other than it is. And so I'm going to now talk about empathy, and I really want to argue that I gave a talk a while ago called Empathy at a Cost. And my notion of empathy, what I call authentic empathy, is empathy that costs you something. It's not cheap. It requires that you give of yourself. And I want to talk about comparative literature, interestingly, in that way, because in comparative literature, when I went to graduate school, you had to take X number of languages. I went to Berkeley, and so one of the requirements of your language requirement was you had to take a distant language. And we students were always saying, what's distant? And they said, well, they kept moving the goalpost, as things went along. But the idea was to get out of your usual Eurocentric habits and go someplace further, which is laudable. But and that's why I went into comp lit rather than English, because I appreciated that notion that you were going to be forced out of your ordinary spaces. And yet, comparative literature has remained very, very Eurocentric and very much rooted in assumptions about what a narrative is, what a poem is, what a novel is. There's a wonderful book by Mary Layoun called Travels of a Genre, looking at how a novel form can move through all these different spaces and change, right, because of the impact of different cultures. So there's a real reluctance to move outside of what might be called one's natural language. But that's the whole project of comparative literature. And politically speaking, it's crucial to use our imaginations to be able to conceptualize non-obvious connections. And so I want to talk about material history here. There's a very, very wonderful interview that Edward Said did with the British historian Raymond Williams. And he's writing in the late 80s. And Raymond Williams speaks, quote, "The analysis of history is not a subject separate from history, but the representations of history are always part of history." In other words, as I said about language is embedded in history. There's no neutral medium. And they contribute to history and are active elements in the way history continues, right? They propel history forward. They are part of that whole system of justification. And they take part in the way forces are distributed, in the way people perceive situations, both from inside their own pressing realities and from outside them. I'll repeat that line. Both from inside their own pressing realities and from outside them. If we are saying this is a real method, then the empirical test is being put to here is that comparable methods of analysis are being applied to situations that are very far apart in space, in other words, distant. They have many differences of texture, have very different consequences in the contemporary world. And then he says, there's an obvious distance from what is happening in the English countryside or in the English inner cities to the chaos in Lebanon. Yet nonetheless, I think it is true that the method, the underlying method, found a congruity. So a congruity, not a perfect replica, but it's the capacity to imagine that things are alike in some fundamental way, whatever way that is. So here you have somebody whose key work has been on the city and the country and English history, talking to Said and looking at what's happening in Lebanon and saying, no, there's no way you can perfectly say that they are alike, but in some ways the forces, the issues are congruous. So that's the positive. But what about empathy, and what about conflict, and what about our imaginings about what is near and what is far and what is too far? And for that, I have a personal anecdote, which has always stuck with me. So I was involved in the, I don't know if you know about the fact that the American Studies Association several years ago endorsed BDS. And I was part of that, and fortunately or unfortunately, somehow the New York Times put a quote from me in their story. And so I came home to my wife, and I said, let's go to a movie. And so we're standing in line, and who's in front of me but this friend of mine who's Jewish, and turned around and said, well, we have to talk about this. I said, okay, that's fine. And this kept happening. All of a sudden I was, in the center of this discussion. And I was having lunch innocently by myself one day, and a friend of mine who was a Jewish historian came up to me, and he placed his hand on my shoulder in a rather ominous kind of way. He said, David, I know why I'm obsessed about Jews, but why are you? And it took me a while to sort of think of what I was going to say, and the most natural thing to say was, I'm not obsessed with Jews. I care about Palestinians. But look at the language that's used, right? It's not just and especially since I'm Chinese American. I mean, people cannot map that at all. Why aren't you protesting Tibet? I said, well, I do protest Tibet, but I mean, I'm not. You can do more than one thing at one time. And I said, why obsession? And it was simply because I'd taken a political stance that seemed extreme, right? So, but that was very discouraging to me. The fact that a gesture of solidarity, which is what I'm going to end my talk with, was seen as almost insanity, a pathology that I would be taken out of my, my proper sphere of empathy and care, and transported for some God knows unknown reason to care, to be obsessed with Jews, which was his way of understanding the situation. I guess that's the other thing that was discouraging. This is what, and he's not the only one. I get lots of hate mail that says basically the same thing. You know nothing about Israel, Palestine, go to China. So I mean, and this is exactly the opposite vision of the world that Edward Said represented. He would be horrified. I mean, he was horrified because I'm sure he was approached with very much the same kinds of statements. You belong here, you belong there. That's not the world of comparative literature, nor should be the world, period. So let me go into part 3, empathy, solidarity, literature. Good news, because I want to leave you with good news. It's always the young people. It always is, because I grew up, post-war era, World War II, and I'm teaching a course right now with Joel Boehner called Making Palestine Visible, and I just showed a clip from Exodus. I mean, I grew up with that narrative, with that hit song, with a novel, with Paul Newman. He was so young in those days. And that's and the narrative of the Holocaust, which was profoundly upsetting, obviously. But that was the only narrative, right? There was nothing else. And finally now, through the hard work and persistent work of so many people like yourselves, another story is getting out. And one of the things that's most encouraging about being on college campuses now is that it used to be that students just don't want to hear. They put their hands over their ears. That's too divisive. Now students, I really believe, feel like it's their responsibility to at least know something about it. They may not, no matter what side you're on, they want to know because something is exerting so much pressure. And you might say, yes, it's thanks to the internet. Some of it is. Literally, the fact that more and more images, photographs, stories are circulating outside of mainstream news, I think that does matter. So one thing that you all know the story, the tragic story of Rachel Corrie. And Edward Said said in 2003, and with respect to what I just said, what Rachel Corrie's work in Gaza recognized was precisely the gravity and the density of the living history of the Palestinian people as a national community, and not merely a collection of deprived refugees. That is what she was in solidarity with. And we need to remember that that kind of solidarity is no longer confined to a small number of intrepid souls here and there. And this is 2003, and it's only gotten better since then. In the past 6 months, I have lectured in 4 continents to many thousands of people. What brings them together is Palestine and the struggle of the Palestinian people, which is now a byword for emancipation and enlightenment, regardless of all the vilification heaped on them by their enemies. So, as Martin Luther King said, it's a long arc for justice, but we are making that turn, I think. But it demands that we are open to these kinds of calls for solidarity because it's a very lonely process. And I don't know if you know the fabulous novella by Kanafani, Men in the Sun. I taught that recently, and it's a very, very wrenching novella. And yet there's one moment in it that's strangely peaceful and positive. And I was trying to make sense of it. And it comes from the narrative. There are 3 men who are trying to go to Kuwait to work in the oil fields from an Iraqi refugee camp. And the middle person, Marwan, has this moment of peace in the middle of this horribly stressful and despair-filled moment. And Kanafani writes, crowds of people walked past without paying him any attention. Perhaps it was the first time in his life that he found himself alone and a stranger in a throng of people like this. He wanted to know the reason for that remote sensation that gave him contentment and rest, a sensation like the one he used to have when he finished watching a movie. And it felt like life was grand and vast, and that in the future he would be one of those men who spent every hour and every day of their lives in exciting fulfillment and variety. But what was the reason for his having such a feeling now, when he had not seen a film for a long time, and only a few minutes before, the threads of hope that had woven fine dreams in his heart had been broken? In fact, it surprised him that the letter he had written his mother could give him that marvelous feeling, which made his disappointment appear less important than it really was. It was a silly letter, one which he had written under the influence of a feeling of loneliness and hope on the roof of a miserable hotel in the end of the world. And so when I talked to my class about that, I said, what's giving him this sense of peace and contentment? His dreams have been shattered. Kanafani says he knows his mother already knows the story, so it's irrelevant information. And the only way I can make sense of this is that it's the role of the writer to write and to imagine a connection with somebody else, and to think that the act of writing itself, no matter what the result is important. And I'm going to take a slight detour as I come to the conclusion of my talk, because it's a marvelous quote that, again, helps globalize the vision that I'm trying to bring about today in my talk. And it's from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Nobel acceptance speech from 1982. Because I want us to, again, not think of things as distant and irrelevant, but see things, as Raymond Williams says, as congruous together. So I want you to listen carefully to these next two paragraphs because it's a beautiful speech. 1982. 1 million people have fled Chile, a country with a tradition of hospitality. That is about 10% of its population. Uruguay, a tiny nation of 2.5 million inhabitants, which considered itself the continent's most civilized country, has lost to exile 1 out of every 5 citizens. Since 1979, the civil war in El Salvador has produced almost 1 refugee every 20 minutes. That country could be formed, the country that could be formed of all the exiles and forced immigrants of Latin America would have a population larger than that of Norway. I dare to think that it is this outsized reality, not just its literary expression, that has deserved the attention of the Swedish Academy of Letters. A reality not of paper, but one that lives within us and determines each instance of our countless daily deaths, and that nourishes a source of insatiable creativity, full of sorrow and beauty, of which this roving and nostalgic Colombian is just one cipher more, singled out by fortune. Poets and beggars, musicians and prophets, warriors and scoundrels, all creatures of that unbridled reality, we have had to ask little of imagination, for our crucial problem has been a lack of conventional means to render our lives believable. That, my friends, is the crux of our solitude. I'll just read that last line because it's so beautiful. Poets and beggars, musicians, prophets, warriors, scoundrels, all creatures of this unbridled reality, we have had little to ask of our imagination, for our crucial problem has been the lack of a conventional means to render our lives believable. This, my friends, is the crux of our solitude. And as we all might suspect, the opposite of solitude is, of course, solidarity. So I want to close with a quote from Edward Said that both argues the Palestinian case, but also reflects back on the passage I just read from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as well as my remarks about comparative literature. And so this is my last quote from Edward Said. The point I'm trying to make is that we have to see the Arab world generally, and Palestine in particular, in more comparative and critical ways than superficial and dismissive books like Lewis's What Went Wrong and Paul Wolfowitz's ignorant statements about bringing democracy to the Arab and Islamic world. Whatever else is true about the Arabs, there is an active dynamic at work because a real people live in a real society with all sorts of currents and cross-currents in it that can't be easily caricatured as just one seething mass of violent fanaticism. The Palestinian struggle for justice is especially something with which one expresses solidarity, rather than endless criticism and exasperated, frustrating discouragement and crippling divisiveness. Remember the solidarity here and everywhere in Latin America, Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia, and remember also that there is a cause to which many people have committed themselves, difficulties and terrible obstacles notwithstanding. Why? Because it is a just cause, a noble ideal, a moral quest for equality and human rights. End quote. I can think of no better way to end my talk than by using Edward Said's words to once again help us set the course for the continuation of the struggle for Palestinian rights and recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad. My name is Said Erekat. I'm a Palestinian journalist. You gave such a profound lecture. I'm reluctant to disturb it with a question, but I'm going to ask nonetheless.
No, please do. That's why I'm here.
My question to you, since you spoke about sort of the starting point back in the early 80s or thereabout, if there was let's say an empathy scale, and there is a needle on that empathy scale for the Palestinian where would it be today? And what are the things that may make that needle move faster or higher? Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, one thing that helps it move is violence. In other words, and that's a sad commentary on our world today. 2014 was horrific. And one of the things that helped create empathy, again, was the fact that people took the power of representation into their own hands. And if you look at, there's a Tumblr site called, I forget what the name of it is, you could probably find, but it was basically an amazing set of, Tumblr lets you upload photographs globally, and it was everything from large towns like in London, expressing solidarity, to little towns like Akron, Ohio. And it was that sense that it wasn't, as Edward says, the purview or the responsibility of just those who were most immediately affected by it. But ordinary people saw what was going on in Gaza and were horrified and empathetic in a way that I've never seen in my life. And I think that that's hopeful in that regard. I think, though, that even setting aside violence, I think there are two things. One is you could say, well, victories always help bring empathy because they help sort of energize people. But I think also just, and this is the main reason that I'm so involved in BDS, is, we often lose battles. But the battle is not to win a divestment vote or a boycott vote necessarily. It's just to normalize the conversation. Just to have it out in front of people, and you just come back year after year after year. That moves the empathy needle. It's the fact that it's easy to be unempathetic if you are complacent with ignorance, if you just basically feel, I don't need to know this. So the first step is always to build a platform of being receptive to knowledge. So I think in terms of the empathy, say I was just talking with Ariel about this over lunch, and we were very optimistic. I think that we feel that there are lots of not just SJPs, but a lot of other organizations that even Open Hillel is tremendous. It's a tremendous accomplishment, and it came with a cost. Talk about empathy with a cost, but it's when people are. And they set an example, let me put it that way. That's the other thing that gives me hope. When you see young people taking the criticism, the hits, the ostracization for taking a stand, you feel empathetic toward them, but you also say it's possible to do that. And then one of their friends will do it, and then somebody else will do it, and may not be full out, building an Open Hillel, but they'll be saying, well, why don't we think of that? That's why the imagination is so important for Darwish and for Said and for so many of us. It's just that we have to break out of our ordinary habits of accepting the world as it is. It's almost an existential issue, right? And so that's why, I'm going to promote literature again, right? This is I'm teaching a course with historians, so we're always sort of, saying, facts don't count. He says, of course we need facts. And I said, well, we can coexist. The imagination and history, because for a political project like this, you obviously need both. So, and this is for everybody. My email address is available from the center. Please keep in touch. And if I don't answer your questions today, and if often with me, I go to a lecture and then a week later, I'm trying to ask that question. Just email me. This is such an honor to speak with you. I'd like to be able to continue the conversation. So, yeah.
You get a question over here.
Okay. Thanks for the inspiration, and thanks for Edward Said and his works. I am a fellow traveler in the journey towards a more enlightened world. I just published in January a memoirish kind of take on the world entitled Liberation, A Quest for a New Humanism. Because it's my way of turning the tables and deepening the conversation and going to the meat of our predicament and the essence of it. So I'm very happy to meet you. Thanks for the people who put this together. Human yearning for truth and fairness and justice never dies. And I think we become more human when we actually practice justice and fairness. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
And by the way, my book is available on Amazon.com.
Great.
And Barnes and Noble. And by the way, I also, just to show you, I founded the International Peace Quest Institute.
Oh,
so I am deliberately swimming against the current in this town.
Yeah.
I'm not it's not a suicide,
Yeah.
but somebody has to stand up for something that
Thank
is
you.
more uplifting and positive. And we can't do this without you. So whoever is interested in what I shared, please feel free to communicate with me, because it's for all of us. It's not a one-man show. We are all together in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll let you decide who's going to.
Hi, I'm very curious. I'm retired now, but I taught Spanish literature for many years at the undergraduate level. And you probably know about Said's essay on Joseph Conrad on Heart of Darkness, right? And one thing that was constantly coming up, not constantly, but came up in class was how do you handle a writer, for example, like Sela, who won the Nobel Prize, who was a collaborator with Franco and censorship, with Simone de Beauvoir's critique of Hemingway, for example. What do you do? Do you condemn a writer for being right wing? Do you accept? You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater? How do you deal with problematic writers? Do you call it art? Do you critique it politically? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, thank you for that simple question. I think that my wife is a scholar of French literature, and she says the same thing about Proust. Who had horrible habits and things like that. And so you asked many questions in that one question. One is, do you call it art? Well, you would default to the first position that I articulate. You take it apart as an object, as you would. There's a famous essay called The Well-Wrought Urn, the Cleaneth Brooks thing. So you do that, and then you decide if that satisfies aesthetic criteria. But I think you put that knowledge into your understanding of the historical context of the work of art. And you can see how, in philosophy, Heidegger, who's, the same kinds of issues, or Paul de Man in terms of that. And you can see it becomes an interesting but not absolutely determining factor in their production, right? You can see how certain images or certain ways of expressing the world could come from a point of view that was also informed by this other thing. You understand? In other words, you create a larger understanding of the human being that made it. So I don't not teach somebody just because he or she is deficient ethically or whatnot. I just say that this is part of the person that we're reading. But art also is not completely tethered to reality. Again, if it were, then it wouldn't be art. Right? So I try to always see what imaginative space, and you might even find that in their art they create something that's quite different. So it might show that there's a kind of, dynamic going between good and evil or whatnot, something like that. So, but I don't, I address it. I don't try to say, well, it doesn't exist. It's something. And the thing about Conrad was that, in many ways, Heart of Darkness is an anti-imperialist novel. There's really no doubt about it. But its depictions of Africans were of its time. That doesn't excuse it, but it's another piece of information that actually, as a teacher, I use. In other words, I don't say, okay, here's the way to read the text, because that's not teaching, it's dictating. I try to get the students to take their own chances, and I don't approve one or the other. So I use it more also as a sort of provocation.
Thanks so much for your talk today. That was really inspiring. I just want to make sure you get more literature questions from the audience.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
And it's just to sort of in the spirit of what you're thinking in terms of empathy and connection. Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Kanafani have a similar intellectual formation in that they were both reading the same writer. So Kanafani writes Men in the Sun in 1961, publishes in 1962, on the heels of reading a translation of William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which was translated from English to Arabic by another Palestinian living in Baghdad, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. Publishes that in 1961. Kanafani reads it in 62, reads it and then publishes Men in the Sun. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this conversation, this is just really fleshing out more the connections you're making is that here we have Palestinian authors in Baghdad, Beirut, and they're connecting with a Colombian writer through Oxford, Mississippi. And this is why this all belongs in American studies. So hats off to you.
Exactly. Thank you, Elliot. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Steve France. I have a young friend who grew up in a Palestinian refugee camp in Bethlehem. I'm representing him in his asylum case. And he's a really cool guy. And one of the coolest things about him, which I'm privileged to be involved with a little bit, is that he went to Al-Quds University and had a professor who assigned Kafka stories. And my friend did not know who Kafka was, and he has become completely, terribly closely bonded to him. He's writing an essay. I'm saying like, go to Arabic. Don't write it. But it's going to end up extremely interesting. But he learned very quickly from his professor. Oh well, this guy Kafka was a Jew, and he lived at this and that, and at this very same time, there's been this big fight in Israel about lost manuscripts. That were claimed by Germans, I think, but then the Israelis say no, he's our hero. He belongs in our museum, and so on and so forth. So how do you see that kind? I'm trying to figure out the empathy between him and Kafka, because you go, well, it's a Kafkaesque situation, right? But it isn't really, because the whole thing about Kafka is you don't know who's doing this to you and why and so on, whereas for him, he knows exactly who's doing it. So I just thought you might, have a comment on that.
Well, one way to address your question is that there's, I'm sure you know it, an essay by Sartre called "What is Literature?" And he says that, once the writer puts it into circulation, it's a gift, and he can't determine what happens with the gift. And that, in his usual existential kind of way, says what you have is the reader then, taking responsibility for the text, and the writer can't then take it back. So I think that we, I talk to students often about this because they say, well, you make the text what you want, but you can't do everything with it. And they say, well, that's sort of like baiting and switching. You can't do that. And I said, no, that literature is not just a bunch of sentences on a page or a series of pages. It's a system of meaning, right? So there are constraints on the way meaning can be produced by a text. You're not given absolute license. So your responsibility is to read intelligently. And if you think of something that looks plausible, that's working out through an intelligent application of your readerly skills, and it's different from somebody else's, if their reading comes from has gone through a similar process, then you're both, you both have a legitimate right to it. So whatever he's making out of Kafka, and this gets back to, the affective power of literature. Sometimes it can't be put in words. Maybe it's a part of his experience that doesn't line up neatly with Kafka, but somehow it spoke to him in a way that let him understand that experience differently. And if he wrote on that, if he did sort of now I'm going to write a story, I may not necessarily see Kafka in it at all. But literature often produces in us something that can't be traced back to it. Do you understand? Does that make sense at all? You'll read something, you'll forget you even read it. But it's changed your life in some way or another. And then the way that you come upon the world differently may or may not be discernible, like I'm having a Faulknerian moment now. It doesn't work that way, but rather, we are composite individuals, and this gets back to the empathy thing. The more we filter out, and I'm going to go for Hemingway, not Faulkner. This is the way that we lose the world. The way that we gain the world is being receptive to synthesis. Yeah.
Question over here.
I have a question that has been going through my mind for quite a while. The fact is that the Arabs in general and Palestinians at this point in particular have not demonstrated the ability to do much in terms of literature, except maybe in poetry, like you mentioned, and in song I see lately, which is maybe poetry. My question is, and I don't know if that's related to this or not, the fact that our education, because I was educated in Palestine during the British Mandate and later, our education lacks any Arabic literature or any Arabic knowledge as it is. In school, I've learned, even in high school, about British literature. I read Jane Austen and Dickens and on, the romantic poets. And so I know very little, even though I went to the American University and there too. I don't have that.
Yeah.
I have a little theory, maybe it's far-fetched. The fact is that you were talking about territory and the narrative. Maybe it is intentional. Maybe they wanted us not to dwell on something that would come to haunt both the British and the Israelis. And that might be a reason, could be far-fetched. However, it makes me wonder. All these young people who study abroad, they come to the States, they go to Europe universities. They may, if they want to go into the humanities and the arts, they study French or British or American literature. Very few write. We don't have a lot of thought expressed in literature, and I wonder why.
Well, I think a lot of what you said explains. I mean, you've come up with some very plausible answers, but I also think that there is, if you take it outside of a very strict definition of literature or artist, that means there's amazing art and music and poetry that circulates outside of schools. In other words, if you take the appearance on a college or high school syllabus as an indication of doing something with literature, then you have one metric. But if you go on the web, or you go into the streets, or you hang out with people, it's flourishing. I mean, there was just an article in The Guardian, right, about art in Gaza, which was quite interesting. It came out, I think, yesterday, the day before yesterday. So I think that, we're used to thinking of, and I understand your point, because art becomes institutionalized and therefore validated and given, value in through these institutions. But I think that one of my battles is to, when people say, well, the humanities are dying, I say, go out into the streets. I mean, just forget about it being on a syllabus. Forget about getting an A for doing something. Just, pick up a guitar. I mean, we are responsible for the humanities in ways that go way far away from the university. So I would give you hope in that way. Really, there's just so much art and great literature and poetry, spoken word stuff amazing stuff. So, exactly, yeah.
I'm going to bring the conversation back to BDS for a moment. So in this country, now in 21 states, it's a punishable offense to advocate BDS, and senators at the national level want to make it a nationally punishable offense. What's the best strategy to turn this around?
Well, yeah, there was this recent article about how some disaster relief companies, if they, well, this is a crucial question, and here we are in Washington. The problem is, I mean, there's so many difficulties. One is that, because I also do some work with immigrant rights and talking with people working in that area, and they say the Department of Justice is completely hijacked, and that certain policies that were never really acted upon previous to Trump are now being, you can do anything. So there is this sort of chaos being perpetrated, and all of our usual documents and institutions are afraid. The Constitution, this, I mean, all. So I would normally say, well, it's our constitutional rights, right of free speech, the Claiborne hardware case. I mean, all these things are clear indications this is totally legal, and it's illegal to suppress free speech. But these days, the field has changed so much. Nonetheless, the best strategy, I think, is to keep fighting. I think that fight on the basis of our constitutional rights. Put out the contradictions. I mean, we all know about the Palestine exception. I mean, just keep on, pressing how discordant it is between preaching one thing and doing the other. But again, there's not going to be a key that will be turned and will be safe. It'll be persistence. It'll be absorbing defeat and rechanneling our energy. And every time I hear Angela Davis speak, she says the same thing. I will never see freedom in my own time. And yet, she's 73, and you just keep, you have to. And somebody asked me just this, when I arrived here, how do you do all your teaching and all your blogging and all this? And I'll give you my answer, which is I'm just pissed off. I mean, it's just, at a certain point, I do try to take naps and all that, but it's important to, consolidate your energy. But so I'm with you. I don't have a simple answer. I just think, talk to people, get more people to sign up. And, I do think that I mean, Ariel was talking about the fact that, Issa Amro got face-to-face meetings with members of Congress. That's huge. Like, Ariel is amazing and works miracles. Clone her, But so there is progress, and so you don't accept defeat. Keep plugging, and from talking with Ariel, it's a long process. Now she's going to the Senate, so we need each other. We need each other's strength. We need to lean on each other, and we'll get there one day. Thank you for your question, though.
Thank you for a very inspiring lecture, for your entirely inspiring career, and for inspiring answers to these questions. I first wanted to make a comment about a previous questioner's question about Kafka, and then I wanted to ask you, although I'm a fellow professor of literature, a non-literary question. A year or two ago, we had at Busboys and Poets a wonderful presentation by some writers from Gaza who it was a collection called Gaza Writes Back. The editor, whose name I'm stupidly have forgotten right now, is a professor of literature in Gaza. And he talked so movingly about teaching Shakespeare to his students in Gaza, and about the fact that they were able to identify with Shylock, not with Othello,
Wow.
but with Shylock.
Yeah, yeah.
And he quoted some of the papers that he got from students, taking, Shylock's famous "has not a Jew hands, eyes,"
Yeah,
etc.,
bleed, yeah, yeah.
and applying it to Palestinians. So I guess that would be my answer to the Kafka question.
Yeah.
But at the beginning of your lecture, in your quotations from Said, you talked about the fact that not having a state was very problematic for Palestinians in developing their narrative and in getting their narrative out before the public. And of course, for a long time, there was this emphasis on a two-state solution. So I wonder, what your thoughts are and how you would pursue your comments about a state, given the current situation and what looks like perhaps a different reality or solution on the horizon than a Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, what I was getting at in terms of statelessness was very specific. In other words, there's the Covenant on Refugees, et cetera, and Saeed's saying, we don't want to be those aren't the rights we want or deserve. We want the rights that accrue to states. So it was a very specific context of representation. It was being able to be represented as a sovereign state. So that's that. But your second question was how that would then translate into the current day with the current situation. Could you be more precise?
Well, what I mean is the two-state solution.
Yeah.
I think almost everybody thinks
Yeah.
it's dead.
Yeah.
Or knows it's dead.
Yeah.
And currently, activists for Palestinian rights are focusing on rights rather than on a state. And I was wondering.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, this goes back to the BDS question, right? Because BDS, I mean, the success is also its limit. In other words, it's based on human rights, and so it appeals from that non-state actor type of perspective, not to create a state, but to make a state possible. And then the nature of the state, if it ever comes around, will then be determined by the Palestinians. But the whole notion of BDS is to appeal to the international community. So that's why I think they're foregrounding rights, because you have to do that, but they can't do it through a state mechanism, so they do it through an international mechanism. Yeah, so they can't, arguing for a state would not, I mean, obviously Palestinians do, but in terms of BDS, that's a separate issue.
We're going to have time for one more question.
Okay. There's one in the back, I think. Oh.
Thank you very much. I really like what you said about Heart of Darkness, but I keep thinking how a narrative is told and retold, and it's retold in Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's basically going down a river and becoming more and more primitive and really kind of losing the essence of the soul that holds things together. So I'm just wondering how the retelling of these stories are really teaching people how to hold their soul together, whatever that means, in the midst of darkness, in which there is so much. Even I just flashed on the Passover story in Egypt, and there's a threatening to the soul, and there's a disinheritedness to the land. I'm Jewish by background, but I can see the same narrative in the Palestine story when you lose your connection to the land, and if you're very much of a land-based people, and you begin to feel like you've lost your identity and lost your soul.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just wondering how literature can inform people how to hold that together, because these are difficult journeys.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think that you put your finger on it in that literature is repurposed in different historical contexts, and so how to retain in any different or discrete historical context, what do you mean by soul? And what do you mean the challenge that is wrenching it from your possession? And what would it mean? What would the mechanisms be whereby you would retain it? All those, Said would say, that's the world. In other words, the world isn't, these stories have a kind of evocative, universal transcendent power, and yet we are human beings with biology, and we're living in whatever year this is. And, so that the way that we interpret it and bring it into our world will be particular. So that's one thing that makes art possible. If it was only locked into, 1785, to pick a random number, then it wouldn't have any relevance to us. I mean, There's a Soul in 1785 has nothing to do with us. And the solution is that, but it only works in 1785. So we have to bring ourselves into it. And we can't mystify the object as something apart from us. It counts on us to bring it alive in the first place. So that's one of its really powerful moments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palumbo-Liu. We really appreciate you coming out. Thank you.